So here is your mission tonight, should you accept it. Remember everything we have covered up to this point, particularly last week's session, so that you can lay it alongside everything you will hear tonight. While Christendom was rooting itself in Europe, this fusion of church and state power, so grafted together that they would become inseparable, something else was brewing in the south and in the east, in the desert, and ultimately all across the Middle East, Asia Minor, the Balkans, Northern Africa, and into Spain and Europe proper, and that is the emergence of Islam as a religious, political, and a cultural force. Whereas Christianity began as a movement divorced from power, antithetical to power. Islam does not have such a beginning. We might say that Muhammad had no such illusions. It never wavered in the beginning as being both a religious and a power movement. Islam-Adam, we might say, was automatic. Their Muhammadan shift was never a shift. It's where they started, with religion and state power being fused together. Islam does not have a centuries-long sorting it out or arriving at Christendom, their version of it. It began with a single man, single ruler, and stayed largely centralized as such for centuries. And so we'll begin right there. I can remember in the late 1990s, I taught a couple of quarters of Christian history for the New Orleans Baptist Theological Seminary Extension. And the classroom text that we used at the time, and I've still got it somewhere, was this big 500-page treatise on Christian history. Fairly modern. And Muhammad was mentioned in it one time. 500 pages. Christian history, Muhammad's mentioned one time. And you really can't understand Christianity's place in the world without some understanding of it laying alongside and often in conflict with Islam. For 1,400 years, it has grown, and as recently as the 1980s, it was being ignored, and we no longer have that luxury. Islam literally means submission, and it began in the Arabian Peninsula. Today, it makes up about 25% of the world's population. There are 1.8 billion Muslims. A Muslim is simply one who submits, with 2.3 billion Christians, 1 billion Hindus, 16 million Jews, about 500,000 Buddhists. If current trends hold, and it appears that they will, by 2050, the number of Christians and the number of Muslims by percentage will be about equal. So if you don't come to some understanding about Christianity and Islam, the world might not survive another century. And everyone here tonight, everyone in this room, even young Braden and Caden over there, lives in the aftermath of the most recent West and East conflicts, the most recent, what some would say, Christian and Islamic conflicts, going all the way back to post-World War II, intensifying in the 1970s and 80s, and then re-intensifying, of course, the turn of this century for the last 25 years. So tonight, holding our Christian history close, we'll talk about the origins of Islam, we'll talk about Muhammad and the Quran, the Islamic expansion to the borders that I mentioned earlier, and finally the institutionalism of Islam. Not unlike the Roman Church, they sorted out their sacraments, so to speak, though they don't refer to those as sacraments. So Muhammad was born in 570, maybe 571 AD. You have a timeline there for you in what is today Western Saudi Arabia. And he was raised largely by his uncle. His father died before he was born. His mother died when he was 9 years old. His grandfather, who took him in, died 2 years later. And so his uncle was the last of the family, and he took him in. His uncle was a trader, a caravan driver, and he was a teenager when he joined his uncle's family and his uncle's occupation. He became known as Al-Amin, which is a nickname meaning the trusted one. He was smart, he was curious, he was perceptive, he was not a stooge, not in the least. And the Arabian Peninsula during Muhammad's early life was at siege within and without. If we could go to that next map, please. And you have this printed for you, but it might be easier to see up here on the screen. So in the purple there, you have the Eastern Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, centered in Constantinople. And then the Persians still exist, though they are somewhat marginalized. Over in Africa, it's just nomadic tribes. European power has waned because Europe is under the influence of the Byzantines. And when you look at Saudi Arabia there, it is a collection of about 300 different tribes, 400 different deities. It is a pretty wild place. Kamran Pasha says modern-day Afghanistan looks like an advanced civilization by comparison, which is quite a note. And then you have the Assyrians, which is now modern-day Yemen, in the very south of the Arabian Peninsula. And the year that Muhammad was born is known as the Year of the Elephant. The Yemens marched north onto Mecca to take it over, and the Yemenis came on war elephants that they had acquired across the Red Sea from Africa. And so they have this massive army marching north, and they all died outside the gates. And the lore is that God had intervened. Some say there was a bad storm. Some say that birds miraculously started dropping rocks on people's heads. The truth is that a smallpox outbreak wiped out the Yemeni army. And that became known as the Year of the Elephant. Mecca survives. It coincides with the same year that Muhammad is born. So that is the allure of his birth year. Losing a page here. Let's see what other map. It may be. No, not. Just keep it right there. That's good. So Muhammad is in this environment that you see on the screen, and he's a caravan driver traveling all over the Arabian Peninsula into the Middle East and into northern Africa. He is exposed to Judaism. He is exposed to Christianity. He is exposed to all of these primitive religions in Persia and in Africa and in Saudi Arabia. He married a woman while still a young man who was 15 years older than himself, and she was very wealthy, and he could get off the caravan circuit then. And so he goes home and he starts thinking about all these religions and and spirituality. And in 610, when Muhammad was 40 years old, he testifies that the angel Gabriel visited him in a cave during his meditation and commanded him to speak the word of God as God's messenger. And the message that came to him was that there was only one true God, the true God of Judaism and Christianity. So when you hear a Muslim speak of God as Allah, that is a generic Arabic term for God. Muhammad would say, and Hindu scholars would say, that it is the God of Abraham, Jacob, or they would say Abraham, Jacob, and Ishmael is who they would cling to. Allah, God, Yahweh, the same character. There is only one God, was Muhammad's conclusions. There was a man in the 80s and 90s named Phil Parshall, and you won't find, it's an alias because he worked in Morocco as a missiologist and studied Islamic culture. He came to the conclusion that Islam, more than anything else, began as a Christian heresy outside the bounds that the Roman Church could reach. That it was an innovation, culturally adapted in the Arabian Peninsula. Other people say that its origins were purely social. As Christianity, you can say this for sure, as Christianity was used to unite the Roman Empire, Islam was used to unite the Arabian tribes against Christianity, against the Yemens to the south, and against the Byzantine Empire. And that's an important point. It's similar in some ways to the Constantinian shift. But after a decade of preaching and teaching in Mecca, Muhammad ran out of town with a few hundred followers. He traveled to the northern desert oasis of Medina. That's where the term the Haraj comes from, the flight. He fled in 622, and that marks the beginning of the Islamic calendar. But within a few years, Medina and Mecca were at war, and Muhammad re-entered Mecca in 630 as the absolute tribal leader of the Arabian Peninsula with an army of 10,000 fighting men. And immediately, Mecca became a theocracy, with Muhammad renovating a holy site there called the Kaaba and the well of Zamzam. There's a lot of misunderstanding in the 21st century when we talk about something called Sharia law. And I know you've heard that on since September 11th. It was breathed every other day for a few years. Sharia law is simply the religious law versus the civil law of Islam. It is a combination of reading the Quran, the early Islamic scholars, what they had to say about it, and it is theocratic in nature. It can be benevolent, and it can be very oppressive. Not every Islamic country adheres to Sharia law. They may adhere to it in the mosque, but they don't adhere to it at the civil level. For example, Turkey is said to be a democracy. It doesn't operate purely under Sharia law, although there would be folks inside of Turkey who would demand that. And that's much of the conflict inside of Islamic countries. Those who want to hold to civil power over here and keep the theocratic religious power over there. It's the same conversation that Christians had in Europe as Christianity began to grow and to intensify. And it's an ongoing conversation in Saudi Arabia. The current crown prince would love nothing more than for Saudi Arabia. He would like to be a theocratic leader, don't get me wrong, a monarch, but he would like it to be much more open so that he can make much more money and not have to deal with all the scribes and the Islamic scholars who are demanding Sharia law. So the first time that you see any type of the Sharia law theocracy, it's right there with Muhammad at the very beginning. And he renovated the Kaaba, which was this cube, this square. You can Google it right now and see it. It's a big, massive black square where our Muslims come to worship. Arabs had been going to the Kaaba for centuries before Muhammad was ever born. It's been an ancient holy site from who knows when. And again, just as the Christian church adapted local customs to bring everybody in, Muhammad is doing the same thing here. He changes the narrative. And inside the Kaaba is a piece of an asteroid that fell in the Arabian Peninsula, who knows when. Pretty large piece. And it's a center for Abraham and Ishmael with the establishment of the Arabian people. If you go to Genesis chapter 21 and verses 8 through 20, I don't think I have it printed for you, but here it is on the slide. Here is a point of divergence in the Old Testament account where Isaac is the child of promise and would produce the Israeli nation. Ishmael is held by Arabs as the child of promise that produced the Arabs. And it goes back to this passage right here, and Muhammad says that the well of Zamzam, which he renovated at the Kaaba in Saudi Arabia, is the well in the story. When Isaac grew up and was about to be weaned, Abraham prepared a large feast to celebrate the occasion. But Sarah saw Ishmael, the son of Abraham, and her Egyptian servant Hagar making fun of her son Isaac. So she turned to Abraham and demanded, "Get rid of that slave woman and her son. He is not going to share the inheritance of my son Isaac. I won't have it." This upset Abraham very much because Ishmael was his son. But God told Abraham, "Do not be upset over the boy and your servant. Do whatever Sarah tells you, for Isaac is the son through whom your descendants will be counted. But I will also make a nation of the descendants of Hagar's son, because he is your son too." So Abraham got up early the next morning, prepared food and a container of water, strapped them on Hagar's shoulders. Then he sent her away with their son, and she wandered aimlessly in the wilderness of Beersheba. When the water was gone, she put the boy in the shade of a bush. Then she went and sat down by herself about 100 yards away. "I don't want to watch the boy die," she said as she burst into tears. But God heard the boy crying, and the angel of God called to Hagar from heaven. "Hagar, what's wrong? Do not be afraid. God has heard the boy crying as he lies there. Go to him and comfort him, for I will make a great nation from his descendants." Then God opened Hagar's eyes, and she saw a well full of water. She quickly filled her water container and gave the boy a drink. And God was with the boy as he grew up in the wilderness. He became a skillful archer, and he settled in the wilderness of Paran. His mother arranged for him to marry a woman from the land of Egypt. That is the origin story per Muhammad of the Arabian people, and the divergence where Judaism and Islam first go their separate ways. Way back to Father Abraham. Muhammad died unexpectedly in 632. At that time, his teachings had not been collected into what we have as the Quran. That happened about 25 years later. And it has 114 chapters. It's just a little smaller than your New Testament. It's a non-linear collection of the sayings of Muhammad 25 or so years after his death. Questions?
So, getting back to this Gabriel.
Yeah.
Gabriel,
Mm-hmm.
which I assume is the same Gabriel that's the Christian
Mm-hmm.
Gabriel.
Mm-hmm.
So, if you didn't really have a testified Gabriel who's Christian, the word of God would have been the Christian belief system and not his, whatever he's come up with.
Well, and we would say Gabriel would in that context would have been Jewish. Gabriel has never appeared to a Christian that we know of. But you're right, and that's the criticism, is that whatever message Gabriel delivers rings with what Paul would say in Galatians: "If I or someone else should preach another gospel, yea, even if an angel." Now that wasn't written during the time of Muhammad. That was written 500 years before Muhammad. That it should be rejected. But that's the testimony. And so if you were to ask an Islamic person, "Why do you believe that instead of this?" This is the story they're going to tell you. The origin with Ishmael, and then the revelation to Muhammad.
And then my second question, so did he define the word Islam then?
Yes, Islam is an Arabic word. Submission. Yeah. And Muslim is a derivative of that, one who submits. And you'll see they submit to the 5 pillars, and those are coming here shortly. Good question. Any other questions? So let's talk about how it grew. Muhammad solidifies the Arabian Peninsula first. And then the regions from there around the Arabian Peninsula, they fell like dominoes. In order: Palestine, Egypt, Syria, North Africa, Iraq, Persia, modern-day Iran, Central Asia. These are the stands. Stand means essentially place. So think Afghanistan, Pakistan, Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, and finally Spain. And this early expansion of Islam was not purely religious, it was imperial. It was a breakout out of the peninsula for the Arabian people who had been confined there for all of their history. And as they leave the Arabian Peninsula, it's post the fall of the Roman Empire. There is no structure in place to resist it. The Byzantines remain, but this is where you need to remember last week. Europe is in the darkest days that Europe has ever seen. Culturally, religiously, socially, scientifically. I'm going to say it again. They don't call it the Dark Ages for nothing. It was really bad. And here comes this rising power that is, and I'll get to this in a second, culturally, linguistically, scientifically, technologically more advanced than the people they were encountering. And we think in our Western mindset, no way. Surely we've been on top of the world forever. No. And that's one of the main reasons that Islam grows so fast and it doesn't stay this regional sect. There was no check against it. It blossomed in all of these directions. And we're often, even by Christians and Jews, when Islamic armies rolled into town, Jews and Christians met them in the streets with joy. Because Muhammad made the policy that if you're a person of the book, you won't be oppressed. You worship your God because we're all worshiping the same God. And that brought stability. And when you live in those Middle Ages conditions that people were living in, stability, you'll do almost anything for stability and bread and to be left alone. John, did you wave a hand over there? No? Okay. So in a decade, if you look at this, the brown color here, that is all of Muhammad's rule in a decade. And that's his home turf, so to speak. That was home to him, but he did squash the Yemenis in the south. You go to the orange color, the second darkest color there, it is the Rashidun Caliphate. A caliph is similar maybe to our use of the word pope. It means ruler. And think of it as the succession from Muhammad. All the Middle East and parts of Lower Africa and Asia are taken from 632 to 661. And then the Umayyad Caliphate takes over 661 to 750. The Rashidans and the Ayyubids are simply other tribes from the Arabian Peninsula. And they went by their tribal name. But by the time you get to the Umayyads by 750, they're all the way, they've consumed all of Spain, all of Portugal, and they have a foothold inside of France by this time. And what ultimately stopped the Islamic expansion into Europe was a military victory by Charlemagne's grandfather. I mentioned it last week. Charles Martel, 732, the Battle of Tours in central France, fought just a century after Muhammad's death. We don't know exactly where the battle was fought. We don't know exactly how many forces were employed. We don't know exactly what tactics were used, but we do know that Martel routed the Islamic army to such a degree that they never attempted to gain any more European territory. In fact, they lost all of their gains, so that by the time of the Ottomans, they had fallen all the way back into Africa, even though Spain was held by the leftover Umayyad Caliphate known as the Moors. If you've been to Spain and seen Moorish architecture, they had a very, very distinct influence there. The next slide, if you would, Garrett. Here we go. So the Ottoman Empire takes over after the last caliphate falls, and they rule from 1517 until 1924. Again, remember, it's not past. It's very present. And this map is when their empire was at its greatest strength, about 1700. So it's sort of hard to imagine this, that while my Irish ancestors were getting on a boat to come to North America Turkish power to their south and to their east is at its peak. We don't always see that in our history books when we're talking about European colonialism and crossing the Atlantic and discovering the New World. This is one of the reasons that pushed Europeans west, is Turkish power was incredibly strong at its peak about the same time that European powers were starting to reach their peak. And you see the two, I hate to put it in these words, but you see the two sides begin to draw even, so that there's no, they won't war with each other. It's a Cold War kind of a thing. And it remained so, particularly for the Turks, for a very, very long time. All the way to 24. And this is just chase a rabbit real quick. One of the reasons that the world broke into war for World War I is the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. When the Ottoman Empire collapses, you have the exact same thing that happens every time that a long-time power had been in place. This vacuum is created, stability falls, tribalism is created, and the tribes start trying to figure out who's going to be on top. You get one assassination, and you throw a match into the fire. And so you can trace our own Western history in the beginning of World War II with directly the expanse and then the collapse of Islam in Europe. If you see at the top of that map, you see Russia there, and then you drop down and you see Bulgaria and Greece, right underneath Russia, along the Black Sea, along the Aegean Sea, the Balkans. They became such a genocidal place in the 1990s. And that is the last place where, in Europe, where Christians and Muslims were living alongside each other as the Ottoman Empire collapses. And so it has remained a place of conflict for 100 years. Sarajevo, collapse of Yugoslavia, all of those areas. So the state of affairs, and I'll stop for questions in just a second. So the state of affairs, if we can just go back one slide to the previous one. So the state of affairs beginning at 750, as you see there, the Turks come to power. Now you can go back to the previous slide, Garrett, thank you. And they're the ones in power and very dependent upon Persian and Egyptian power. And they would preside over Islam's golden age. All those different advancements. And bring, through the conflicts of the Crusades, some of that technology, so much of that architecture would actually get passed on to Europe, because Europeans finally encountered a culture greater than themselves. And it pulled Europe forward and ultimately toward the Renaissance. Quick questions? Yes. Here? It's a vassal state, so a modern day Georgia and south of there, they weren't directly ruled by the Ottomans, but they paid tribute to the Ottomans. They weren't occupied territory, but they were subjects nonetheless, all the way up into the Balkans and Greece. Good question. The question was, just as Judaism could be oppressive in the time of Jesus, and Christianity after Constantine could become oppressive, do we have the same thing happening with Islam? Yes. Particularly, you would get shown some grace if you were a Jew or a Christian. But if you were not, Uh, there are horrific accounts of Islamic leaders that would slaughter entire regions. Conversion at the point of the sword. Uh, Now, again, it's not original. All three of the Abrahamic faiths have done that. Uh, so there was great violence at times, and there were remarkably long stretches of peace. We'll talk about that when we get to the Crusades. But there's a 400-year window where Muslims ruled the Middle East, and there is no conflict among Muslims, Jews, or Christians. They shared Jerusalem, they shared the Holy Land, and everybody just let everybody be. Centuries long. So it's not all just constant War I, War II, and on to the next one. There's great seasons, hundreds of years of war. And then there are great seasons of peace. It often depended upon who the ruler was at the time. Good question. Did that come from online? That's from you? It looked like you were reading it off a screen. Oh, you wrote it down. All right, good. Other questions? Yes? I would say that the tribalism that Muhammad found a way to overcome the tribalism and to unite the tribes. That he gave them a cause bigger than their smaller priorities and gods, and nationalized the Arabian Peninsula. Think about our own, let's do this, let's think about our own American history. You know, we can have the false idea that the Boston Tea Party happens and every American gets on board and says, yay, we're going to be free. The Revolutionary War starts in the 1770s. It takes more than a decade for the Constitution and the Constitutional Congress to convene, and then they had to get a majority of those colonies to get together on the same page to even create a country. There was a time in North America where a number of states were committed to being their own country, not to be the United States of America. And so it did take people like our founders that made a case that we should get together and stick together. Think of Muhammad rolling into your village. It's not just that he's got a ton of forces, because all these tribes had armies. And saying, if we get together, I've traveled all over the Mediterranean. If we get together, nothing will stop us. And he was right for a season. It's that kind of down and dirty politics and a little strong arming, a little coercing, a little reward for this and for that one, if we can all create this coalition. So I would say, Garrett, that it's overcoming tribalism. Now, and we'll talk about this in just a second, it didn't stick together completely. As soon as Muhammad died, there was conflict about who was going to be in charge next. And that created the divisions that we have in Islam today. I'll get to that real quick. Islam is not monolithic. There are hundreds of varieties of Muslims, just like there are hundreds of varieties of Christians. But there are three major categories. I think you have these on your page, even though you don't have them on the wall. Sunni Islam makes up 84% of Islam today. Shia makes up about 15%, and Sufi makes 1%. Yes, John? It's a new tribalism. It's 100 years ago. That's right. What caused it? Oil. Doug and Anna aren't here, so I can say this without them being here. We'll get into this next week with the Crusades. British Petroleum is as responsible for the fragmentation of the Ottoman Empire as any nation on the face of the earth. The French took Syria. The Israelis took Palestine, the old Palestine, and the Balfour Declaration, not Doug Balfour, but the Balfour Declaration is a chopping up of the Middle East among the European powers for the petroleum resources beneath the sand. And I'll come back to that. I'll come back to that here in just a minute. Sunnis are 84%, Shia 15%, Sufis 1%. It was about succession. These three divided after Muhammad died. The Sunnis believe in the caliphate. They believe that the leader of Islam should be chosen, elected, or by consensus. The Shiites believe that Muhammad's son-in-law and his family line is the true leader of Islam. And there are only a few, watch how this breaks up and see if it doesn't help you make some sense of the news. There are only a few majority Shia countries in the world. Iran, Iraq, Bahrain, and Yemen. Those happen to be Saudi Arabia's nemesis countries. You hear on the news like Iran and Saudi Arabia, Iran against Saudi Arabia. What would the Saudis do? What would the Iranians do? Those are the two largest opposing views of Islam countries in the world. One being Shiite, one being Sunni. And it's a division in Islam that goes all the way back to Muhammad's death. If you'll notice as well, Yemen is a Shia country. Saudi Arabia and Yemen have been at war in some way since the year of the elephant, when the Yemanis could not take Mecca and the army died of smallpox. These are old scores. And now all the accoutrements of religion are attached to them as well. So talk about long-standing excommunications, right? They've got their own, and for many similar reasons. One of the reasons that Islam has had such exponential growth even today is its simplicity. There are 5 things that make you a Muslim that say that you are submitting yourself to Allah, to God. You have the 5 pillars of Islam, and we have it on the screen for you as well. Number 1, the Shahada, the confession or the creed. There is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is his prophet. That is creed, confession, catechism. What's the doctrine of Islam? There it is. Every Muslim hopes and prays that he or she can once in their lifetime say that and really mean it. It's very similar to the Shema, where devout Jews hope and pray for the same thing. Hear, O Israel, the Lord God, He is one. And thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, with all thy soul, and with all thy strength, and love thy neighbor as thyself. That is the basic ethic of Judaism. It is the single confession of Judaism. And this confession, in that way, is very similar. So you say, well, what is the Christian confession? Well, it's about 112 words long. It's the Apostles' Creed, but the shortest would be, Christ died on the cross for our sins, was buried, and rose again. He is risen indeed. When you get right down to the elements of the basic 3 theological creeds of the movements. So the confession is 1. Number 2, prayer, what they call salat. Performed 5 times a day, kneeling on a prayer rug facing the Kaaba in Mecca. Muhammad first prayed toward Jerusalem, but after he purified the Kaaba, he began to turn toward Mecca, and his followers have done the same. Sometimes the prayer is very short. You drop to your knees or stop and pause and say possibly just Allah Akbar. And that's another phrase that, gets a lot of bad press because somebody says that right before something terrible happens. It simply means God is great. And then they may pray the opening verses of the Quran as a short prayer. I'll read it for you. In the name of God, the infinitely compassionate and merciful, praise be to God, Lord of all the worlds, the compassionate, the most merciful, the ruler on the day of reckoning. You alone do we worship. You alone do we ask for help. Guide us on the straight path, the path of those who have received your grace, not the path of those who have brought down wrath, nor of those who wander astray. Amen. Now, anyone who belongs to one of the great monotheistic faiths, the people of the book, could pray that prayer. It's incredibly generic, but that's the opening verses of the Quran. The third pillar is zakat or almsgiving. In Muslim countries, a tax is imposed on personal annual income to collect alms for the poor, their version of Social Security. It's usually about 3%. In non-Muslim countries, alms are collected at the local mosque in the form of voluntary offerings. Number 4, fasting, Sawam or Ramadan. Ramadan is a month-long season of daily fasting, purification, marks the beginning of the Islamic year. It follows the lunar calendar, just like Passover and Easter follows the lunar calendar. In 2024, it will begin at sundown on March 10th. That's earlier than usual, but if you go look at your calendar, Easter is early this year too. You know how that works? First, let me get this right. Passover is the first Friday after the completion of the third full moon. Right. And therefore, Easter is the Sunday following that Passover, and Ramadan moves with the lunar calendar as well. The fifth pillar of Islam is the Hajj, the pilgrimage. Every able body must take the pilgrimage to Mecca if at all possible. Those who complete the journey may take the title Haji into their name. If you ever see a Muslim that has Haji in their name, they've been to Mecca. And then sometimes we have a sixth pillar added to Islam, and it's one that we hear a lot about, especially in the last 25 years, and that is jihad. It would be inaccurate to think of jihad simply as holy war. The word means to struggle. And for most of Islamic history, the jihad was the personal struggle. They talked about the jihad of the heart, to purify their thoughts, to be true to God. Jihad of the tongue. Be careful what you say. Don't use words as weapons. The jihad of the hand. Economic jihad. Buy from those who treat people well. Boycott those who don't. And then finally, the physical jihad. The jihad of the sword. And this is the one that gets all the attention in the 21st century. Well, you're not going to believe this. But guess where the rationale for Islamic jihad came from? It's a Christian theologian, Augustine. If we can have this next slide here. On your left, you have what is called just war theory, as developed by Augustine and finalized by Aquinas in the High Middle Ages. And then on your right, you have Islamic conclusions about when a jihad, actual war, is justified. On the left first, in the West, typically war must be a last resort. And this is the ethics. And we could spend hours just crawling down into the ethics of each one of these statements. War must be a last resort. 2, the cause must be just. Number 3, a legitimate government must make the declaration of war. 4, the end must be attainable. 5, the goal must be peace. 6, the good sought must outweigh the evil inflicted. This is a very important piece that's not talked about in the West today. Augustine and Aquinas said, if you have to go to war, understand that it is evil. It's evil, and the good must outweigh the evil inflicted. And then 7, non-combatants must be protected. These basic concept of just war, whether you think that's just or not, these basic concepts go all the way back to Augustine, finalized by Aquinas. Augustine had lived and died by the time Islam comes along. His body of work is massive. They read Augustine. This is the Islamic conclusion, 4 points. The cause must be just. Number 2, only a legitimate authority may conduct jihad. 3, there must be the hope of success. And 4, peace must be the ultimate goal. Now, before 1983, the idea that an Islamic believer would kill himself in the name of Allah was completely foreign to Islam. In 1980, a war broke out between Iran and Iraq. Now, those of you who are old enough to remember that 1980, the late 70s and early 80s, were quite the ride. And I can remember as a little boy watching that black-robed Ayatollah Khomeini on our television screens and being terrified of this man. And he was a terrifying man. He and Saddam Hussein, remember him, went to war in the 1980s early. Both Shia countries. So they were fighting over their border. And it's impossible to say who did it first, but the first suicide bombers in Islamic history emerged in that war. Women and children were sent to the front lines, often under the guise of bringing water or food with dynamite strapped to their bodies. And then it was institutionalized 3 years later when an Islamic terrorist drove a massive truck into the U.S. Marine barracks in Lebanon. 1983, killed over 200 Marines. That is the birth of the modern Islamic radicalized jihadist. We are living in that generation. This was not the practice before. So where does this come from? Next slide, if you could. This man right here is known as Muhammad al-Wahhab. And he died in the 1800s. However, his influence is incredibly strong. You might hear the phrase on occasion, Wahhabism. Wahhabism is the most radical form of Islam on the face of the earth. I want you to think of people like Osama bin Laden, Hezbollah, Hamas, Al-Qaeda, ISIS, the Islamic Brotherhood. You know these groups. They trace their origins and their influences back to this single man. He saw, and back to you, John, he saw as it became apparent that the Ottoman Empire was slipping, and he saw European influence rising. He is really the beginning of the anti-colonialism movement in the Middle East. And he taught a form of jihad that basically said, you don't need a country to call for a jihad. If the cause is right, call it yourself. And all these phrases we have now, cell groups, lone wolves, all these things he was really advocating that kind of approach to push Europeans out of the Middle East. And then after World War II, when the Middle East became industrialized and the nation of Israel was established, then this Wahhabism really takes traction. And it, for our country, has borne bitter, bitter fruit. Scholars say that maybe 1% of all Muslims in the world would subscribe to Wahhabism. But you don't need many. You don't need many. It's outside traditional, established Islam as it was known for centuries and for centuries. Questions?
What happens if you don't go by these five pillars? What happens to you if you don't?
It depends where you are. The Wahhabis are as hard on their own people, who they regard as heretics, as it would be anybody else. The case study is Afghanistan, the Taliban. Look how they treated their own people. Look how Hamas treats its own people. I mean, we can debate forever about how far should Israel go, but look at what Hamas has done to their own people. And so it just depends where you are. If you're living in Turkey and you're a non-compliant Muslim, nothing's going to happen. I don't know if I should say this. I had a pretty good meal and a night of drinking with some Islamic boys in Bethlehem one time. So, they're forbidden to touch alcohol, but they were having drinks and eating hot dogs. I mean, what do you want me to do? I got some Jewish friends like that too, but I should probably quit talking about that. So it just depends where you are. And think about that in regards to Christianity. Some of us grew up in Christian communities that if we stepped out of bounds, we were treated harshly. And then other of us, we pass in and out of Mass whenever and nobody said a word, right? And so it just depends contextually where you are, what part of the world you're in, and what school of thought you're in.
I guess I can understand that, but eternal, how do they take that if you don't do those five? I mean, what afterlife?
Their afterlife is a little. It's too naive to say, "Well, I killed 100 people as a terrorist, and now I get paradise and 100 virgins." That's really a caricature. Their afterlife is a little bit different than. It takes a little bit of Judaism and it takes a little bit of Christianity. They believe in hell as annihilation. There's no eternal burning hell in Islam, as there is in some Christian theologies. There's no hell at all in Jewish theology. And then heaven is, place of paradise. It's very much in Wahhabism. Kafars, is that right? Does that sound right? Kafar is an infidel. And an infidel is a Westerner, a Christian, a Jew in the Wahhabi radicalized form. But a kafar can be a Muslim that's not strict enough. But again, Christians do that too. We love to call other Christians heretics. Thankfully, we're not killing each other over that right now, but we have. And let me say this, and this is not to defend Islam and its current practices, but think of it like this. Judaism, after the destruction of Jerusalem, had to go through some radical changes that resulted in it being a far less violent faith. Events in the Middle East included, but they've had a long history of substantial change to their faith. They had to. It was temple-based, and when the temple was gone, it became synagogue-based. And it was a whole different way of practicing faith. So Christianity comes along, and when Jerusalem fell, Judaism as we know it was about 1,000 years old. By the time we reach 1,000 years old as Christians, almost simultaneously to the time we launched the Crusades. So there is a sense that these monotheistic religions have to go through a growth cycle, for lack of a better word. And what we see now is this very violent form in some forms. And I'm not saying we just watch what happens, but there is this sense of working it out. And the radicalization of Islam has done as much damage to Islam as it has done to anybody else. Because you look at angry young men in the West Bank, you look at angry young men in Yemen, or Iran, or Iraq, just list the countries. They're poor, and they're being groomed for revolution. While, and most of those are Shiite Muslims, while the Sunni Muslims have all the oil and the money. That nothing holds up for long with that kind of arrangement. Oh, yeah. Yeah. And the brutality in Iran, for example, in the last 10 years, from particularly toward women who, there have been women arrested, hanged publicly for driving a car because it breaks Sharia law. Good night, those that are watching online. We'll catch you next time.